Hello, my name is Bruce Riedel. I'm the director of the Intelligence Project at Brookings Institution. And today we're having a program on anticipating COVID-19. How well did the intelligence community anticipate the worldwide pandemic, which is now staggering the entire world? I'm very happy to say that my guest today is Mr. Chris Whipple. Chris Whipple is a journalist, an author. He published a book a few years ago called Gatekeepers about the chiefs of staff at the White House. And he has most recently published Spymasters, I'll get that in the picture, which is a book about how the CIA directors shape history and the future. It's a really path-breaking book. It's the first book that looks collectively at the modern directors of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms on until the current one, Gina Haspel, and evaluates how each of them have performed and how they have interpreted their jobs in different ways. We'll have time later in the program to talk about all of those issues. I do want to suggest to you that there's a link available through Brookings in order to purchase a copy of the book. And I think you'll find after an hour you strongly want to get it. It's really something quite unique in the intelligence community system. We're going to focus today, at least initially, on the pandemic. The intelligence community, it appears, actually did a fairly good job of warning and anticipating that a pandemic was coming. Can I ask you, Chris, to give us some of the data that points in that direction?
Yeah, Bruce, first of all, before I do, can I just say that thank you for the kind words about the Spymasters. I was lucky enough in doing this book to talk to almost every living CIA director. And I was even luckier to be able to talk to you. You made a tremendous contribution. Without your wisdom, I'm not sure the book would be as good as it is. So thank you. So I have an epilogue in the book. The book, of course, is traces the history of the CIA through the eyes of the directors from Richard Helms all the way to Gina Haspel, as you mentioned. But I have an epilogue at the end of the book that walks through what the president knew and when he knew it about the emerging coronavirus crisis and what the intelligence community told him. And we are suffering, as we speak, the catastrophic consequences of a president who ignored regular warnings about the coronavirus in the president's daily brief that were there throughout January and February. And specifically, he was briefed on January 23rd by Beth Sanner, whose name has now emerged as the briefer at that time. Trump later famously said to Fox that my briefer, that this was the first he'd ever heard of the coronavirus, and that his briefer had said that it was, quote, no big deal, end quote. Now, there's so many things about that statement that are suspect to begin with, which is, first of all, that the president's daily brief is by definition, everything in it is a big deal. When that item is also briefed verbally, in addition to being in the PDB, it's an even bigger deal. When I talked to intelligence officials about this, they all said this makes no sense, that you'd have something that was no big deal in the PDB. But on top of that, my sources tell me, and frankly, it's disappointing that this has been reported in many places since Trump made that statement without challenge. Nobody's really, a number of accounts have really kind of gone along with Trump's version here. My sources tell me that's not at all the case, that the warning was clear cut, and it was that this should be taken very seriously indeed. And I think, Bruce, you probably have sources who have told you the same thing or something similar.
Very much so. I have several people who have said Beth Sanders never said anything like that. She is, of course, in the very disadvantageous position that she is talking about classified information. and she's not allowed to talk about classified information. But you're absolutely right. The PDB rarely errs in the direction of saying, don't worry about something. The institution, as an institution, prefers to err on the degree of the sky is about to fall. No, the whole planet is imploding, rather than saying, don't worry about it. But what's clear here is that the president had very clear warning, and you're right, he chose to ignore it. What's unclear is, did anyone else get warned? It appears that some members of the Congress got some kind of warning. Some of them acted on it somewhat deleterious ways. But the people who weren't warned were you and me and the American people as a whole. That's very disturbing. Wouldn't that warning have been the norm for most directors of Central Intelligence, directors of national intelligence to provide?
Yeah, it would be, and it's almost unimaginable, inconceivable that any previous president would have ignored that kind of warning, which Trump clearly did. It's equally inconceivable that any previous president wouldn't bother to read the president's daily brief, which evidently is the case with this president. So it's really, in my mind, it's a real dereliction of duty. I also talk, as you know, Bruce, in the book about, I have a whole chapter about the walk up to the attacks of 9/11. And in that case, the CIA is, as they say out at Langley, as you well know, in this town there are only policy successes and intelligence failures. My other favorite saying was the one a former director told me, which was, CIA will never be abolished because then presidents would have no one to blame. Well, CIA, of course, was blamed after 9/11, but as I lay out in exacting detail in my book, in the walk up to 9/11, there were multiple warnings. And not only George Tenet and Cofer Black, of course, who tried to warn the Bush White House, but also Rich Blee, who was head of the Al-Qaeda unit, who goes on the record in my book as well. Having said all that, to me, 9/11 was a case famously of quote unquote red lights flashing. COVID-19 was a case of sirens sounding, horns blaring, and a parade down Main Street by comparison. And not just multiple warnings in the PDB and from the intelligence community, but also warnings from the CDC, warnings from the head of HHS. At one point, Azar called Trump at Mar-a-Lago and tried to tell him how serious the coronavirus was as a threat. And he was treated to a diatribe about e-cigarettes from the president. The president didn't want to hear about it. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post recently that said essentially that Trump is unbriefable. You can't brief him because he doesn't want to hear it. And he brings a level of contempt for the intelligence community into this job that nobody, not even Richard Nixon, brought in the past.
Yes, I think your book and others have made that very clear. Using 9/11 as an analogy, George Tenet not only literally driving all across Washington every day, warning congressmen, warning the White House, warning the State Department, warning everybody. He also took advantage of the opportunity to testify on the Hill. I don't recall how much detail he went into, but every January it is the responsibility of the intelligence community to prepare what's called the Worldwide Threat Briefing. And in this briefing, the DCI, other senior intelligence officials go up in front of numerous committees and actually tell the same story over and over again of what they think are the top threats to American interests around the globe and to the interests of our allies. And I can tell you from my own experience, the CIA, National Intelligence put an enormous amount of effort into this. This is one of the most important projects of the whole year. As far as I know, and you reported in the book, in 2020, there was no worldwide threat.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And my feeling about it, and you can read about it in the book, obviously, is that it is absolutely critical. Those briefings are critical in a democratic society. And especially ever since we have had congressional oversight, which came about, of course, in the mid-70s as a result of all the scandals. It's essential that the CIA director be the honest broker of intelligence, not just to the president, but to Congress and the American people. And the WWTA, as you said, is an annual event. It's not required by law, but it has always happened without fail until 2020. I asked Bob Gates, who's been around the block, if in all of his decades of experience in national security, he'd ever heard of the WWTA being not happening. And he said, never before. It's not a coincidence that it didn't happen in 2020. But Bruce, if you'll permit me, I just want to read a little excerpt from my epilogue about something that was in the 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment that almost nobody noticed at the time. It said, quote, "We assess," and this is 2019, January 2019, before anybody had heard of COVID-19, quote, "We assess that the United States and the world will remain vulnerable to the next flu pandemic or large-scale outbreak of a contagious disease that could lead to massive rates of death and disability, severely affect the world economy, strain international resources. Preparations may be inadequate to address the challenge of what we anticipate will be more frequent outbreaks of infectious diseases." That was in the 2019 WWTA. Can you imagine what would have been in the 2020 WWTA when the intelligence community knew that something was coming out of the Wuhan province of China and it was headed straight at us? And everybody knew that this could be another 1918. So it's to me a huge, this is an issue that hasn't been talked about enough. The fact that WWTA was canceled in 2020, and unfortunately, it seems to have happened because the leaders of our intelligence community were afraid to challenge Donald Trump to say things he didn't want to hear in public.
Well, they had unpleasant experience when they had challenged him previous.
That was the beginning of the end for Dan Coates. When Dan Coates in 2019 went before the cameras and said, to his credit, told the truth about global warming and Iran being in compliance with the nuclear accord, and accurately described the extent of the Russian assault on our election in 2016. He told the truth, and he was taken to the woodshed by Trump. I believe it was the next day. And that may well have been the beginning of the end for Dan Coates. But my reaction would be, tough luck. That's your job. You need to do it.
Right.
And he did, to his credit.
That's why you get the Director of Central Intelligence.
Exactly.
As in the marble, when you enter the original headquarters building, the truth shall set you free, which is a pretty high standard for what people are supposed to be doing there. I guess one of my questions about the worldwide threat briefing and other failures to communicate to the public is, to what extent was this the intelligence directors silencing themselves? Or do we have any indication that the White House told them, "We want you to stay shut up on this"?
I'm not sure that I could prove it one way or the other, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure it matters much. I'm not sure that, whether it's the intelligence community leaders censoring themselves or whether it's the White House saying we're canceling this briefing. The result is the same. The result is the politicization of intelligence, the suppression of information that the American people need to know, especially in a time of crisis. And either way, it's unacceptable.
In your study of directors going back to Richard Helms, is there really anything comparable to this level of politicization of intelligence? I mean, the obvious one that people will talk about, and Donald Trump loves to remind the intelligence community all the time, is weapons of mass destruction on Iraq. But even in that case, the intelligence community was out there with its views. They weren't prevented from telling their views. They may have had their views shaped to a certain degree. But is there any real precedence for what we saw on the
Well, it's not the first time we've had a president who was convinced that the CIA is a deep state full of liberal enemies determined to bring him down. That's exactly what Richard Nixon thought of the CIA and Richard Helms, and the Helms, of course, is, in the book, I was lucky because it's a cast of characters John le Carré couldn't dream up, beginning with Dick Helms, dry martini in one hand, cigarette in the other, who could walk into the Oval Office and tell LBJ what he didn't want to hear. LBJ wouldn't always listen. But the obvious comparison here would be between Trump and Nixon. Nixon blamed the CIA for his loss to Kennedy in 1960. He was convinced that the so-called missile gap that John Kennedy ran on in 1960, and he accused Eisenhower and Nixon of allowing the Soviets to get ahead in missiles. It wasn't true, but Nixon was convinced that the CIA had hatched this and fed it to Kennedy, and that Kennedy had used it to win the election. So Nixon came in with similar sort of contempt for the organization, but Donald Trump's campaign to politicize the intelligence community would make Richard Nixon blush. He's been far more overt, flagrant, blatant, and successful than Nixon. And the latest example of it, because we could talk about this all day, but the latest example is the installation of John Ratcliffe as Director of National Intelligence, because Ratcliffe is not, the only qualification Ratcliffe has is that he peddles Russian disinformation as fact. That's about the only thing he's good at in this job. So Nixon's had success. Trump's had success that Nixon could only dream about. To fast forward to 9/11, I was kind of fascinated that the New York Times, I was lucky enough to be on the cover of the New York Times book review last weekend, and the review said that I had offered a damning portrait of George Tenet. And I thought, really? I thought I had been rather kind of nuanced and fair to George Tenet, because the conventional wisdom is that Tenet and the CIA kowtowed to Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld and the rest of them, and in effect made up this case for WMDs in Iraq. I don't think it's that simple. I mean, a lot of people in this country believe it, and Trump exploited that belief in the 2016 election. But it's more complicated than that. And I think you can make a very strong argument that George Tenet wanted to please George W. Bush, perhaps more than a CIA director should, that he got a little bit too close. He certainly failed in that infamous slam dunk meeting to push back and tell the president that we just don't have a very strong case. But having said that, I asked him point blank, did you cook the books? And he practically jumped out of his chair. This was a very rare interview with Tenet. He hardly ever gives them. He practically jumped out of the chair and denied it vociferously. And I think it's hard to make, every study that's looked at this has said that there isn't any hard evidence that the books were cooked by the CIA. They just got it wrong, which is different.
Well, I agree with you. I think George does get a very bad rap for that. The famous slam dunk meeting actually is quite revealing. John McLaughlin, the deputy, a career intelligence analyst or manager of analysis, begins the meeting by laying out the case. And says, here's what we've got. And the president then says, that's it? That's all you've got? That's actually the most important statement in the meeting. George's subsequent interjection, it's a slam dunk, was an unfortunate statement by George. And they revealed that the day before he got fired, so he knew right away he was being set up.
He doesn't deny, of course, he doesn't deny saying it, and he admits it's probably the dumbest thing I ever said. That's what he said.
It was a dumb thing to say, but it doesn't change the tenor of the meeting, which was that the president and his entire national security team was told the evidence of WMD in Iraq is very limited. And if you read the famous NIE, which has now been unclassified, what is striking about that is that on every critical issue, the agency of the government that should know the most about biological weapons or chemical weapons or missiles or nuclear weapons was in strong dissent. For example, on nuclear weapons, the labs, Los Alamos, said there is absolutely no way you can make a nuclear weapon with these tubes. So any careful reader of that document would have come away with the sense that there's a very, very poor case here. Of course, the other reason is what the Bush administration really wanted the intelligence community to say was that Iraq was behind Al-Qaeda and responsible for 9/11. And there, I think George rightly can take a great degree of precision in saying, we said no, but that just wasn't true.
As you know, Bruce, having read the book, that's exactly what Tenet said to me when I said, did you cook the books? And he almost jumped out of the chair. The next thing he said was, if we wanted to cook the books, all we had to do was make a connection between Iraq and the Al-Qaeda hijackers. We never did that. That would have been game, set, match, point over. We never did that. Now, so Tenet deserves credit for that. But Bruce, how do you explain Tenet having signed off on what was so obviously a terribly flawed estimate of WMDs?
Well, I think, as I recall, the argument that was made at the time was we can't fight the administration on every single issue. We're going to pick the priority. The priority is we're not going to make the connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. That means we're going to go with weak evidence on WMD. So we will have fought the main fight. We will not fight the tertiary. The other thing was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and it had used weapons of mass destruction. So it wasn't a very difficult propaganda case to make. You still had to worry about it. Yeah. I want to go back to the pandemic. In 2003, arguably there's an error of omission here in not making more clear to the American public the weakness of the case. In 2020, the American public's not even consulted. And people like you and me went ahead with our lives. In my case, I went ahead with a cruise in Brazil, which had I known how dangerous the virus was, there's no way I would have gone. And there's 200,000 other Americans, plus, paid the ultimate price for the failure of the government to warn them and to ask them to start taking sufficient measures. It seems to me in the history of intelligence, yes, we've had other intelligence failures, but nothing that approaches this, and this is a failure of commission. They knew, but they didn't do anything about it.
Yeah. And that comes back to, if you don't mind, I'll make another distinction between 9/11 and the COVID crisis. I argue in the case of the 9/11 warnings in the book, and I think you agree with me on this, Bruce, that all Condi Rice had to do when warned, as she was in no uncertain terms by the CIA about an imminent attack, arguably all she had to do was call a principals meeting. And had there been a principals meeting where you get all the heads of departments around a table, head of FBI, CIA, and so forth, and shake the trees, stuff falls out. And in all likelihood, I think what would have fallen out, among other things, was the fact that there were 2 Al-Qaeda terrorists on US soil for months prior. That could have resulted in rolling up the whole plot before September 11th. So there was a process failure there at 9/11. We're looking in this case with COVID at something much more egregious, not only in the number of Americans who have died as a result, but it's much more than just a process foul. This wasn't. I was on a program with Olivia Troy, who used to work for Vice President Pence and is now a whistleblower about this whole process. And she said, look, there were plenty of meetings and everybody knew how serious this was. The problem was at the top. The fish rots from the head. And if the president isn't interested in governing, if the president believes in magical thinking, if the president thinks you can just wish away a crisis that is a threat to national security, you're in deep trouble. And we were, and we are.
It's very disturbing. It's also interesting to me that in another case, not of the same magnitude by any means, but another interesting case, Jean Haspel, the current director and the first woman director we've ever had, did stand up, in her own way to Trump. And that's on the issue of Jamal Khashoggi. He very famously went to Turkey right after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. She met with the Turks, she listened to the tapes. She did not go to Saudi Arabia, but she did the investigation on the ground in Turkey. She was something of a Turkey specialist in her career, so she knew them very well. And then she came back and she testified on the Hill that the Saudis were responsible for the murder of bin Salman. Now, she didn't testify in public, and she's never said in public. Gina Haspel never speaks to the public.
Yeah, that's right.
She is the most silent DCI I've ever seen. But she's never denied that was the testimony. And many, many figures from both parties, Republican and Democrat, have said that's what the CIA says. And if you read about Jamal Khashoggi, every article at one point or another says the CIA told the president that Jamal Khashoggi was killed by the Saudis. Very few CIA judgments get this much attention as this one does. In a way, she stood up to the president there. It's very regretting that on a much more important issue, she did not, and has not really stood up to him to this day. It's October 2020. American people have a right to know who knew, when did they know it, and what did they do about it. And unfortunately, we're not getting that kind of information from the intelligence community leadership.
I agree with you. And this is something that I write about, as you know, throughout the book. And it goes all the way back to Dick Helms and prior to Helms. I'm sure it was true with Dulles and others. Helms famously said, "It's not enough to ring the bell. You've got to make sure the president hears it." And that's one of the toughest things, if not the toughest thing for every CIA director, because it's an almost impossible balancing act. On the one hand, you've got to tell the president hard truths, but you've also got to have his ear. That's difficult in the best of times. It's almost mission impossible with this president. So I would never want to underestimate or minimize the challenge that Gina Haspel faces with this president. And there were high hopes for her. I think in the beginning, among a lot of people, and John McLaughlin told me, he thought, George Tenet's deputy, told me that, boy, if anybody can get through to this guy, I think she's got a shot, blah, blah, blah. It's been disappointing. In fairness to her, we don't know what she says behind closed doors with Trump for sure. We don't know how much she's pushed back. And we probably never will know, because Gina Haspel is the least likely director ever to write a memoir, I would guess. Although Dick Helms said he would never write one either, and he wound up doing it eventually. So in fairness, we don't know that, but what we do know is troubling, as you say. She deserves credit for Khashoggi. I would totally agree with that. But in other cases, again, the failure to testify in public, she's been AWOL on a number of occasions when she should have been speaking to the public. She clearly feels that she needs to keep her head down and not get it shot off. But I feel that the CIA director, as I said before, has to be that honest broker of intelligence to not just to the president, but to the public and to the Congress. And just to give you one example, I spoke to one former acting director of CIA who said that if the president had said what he said about Beth Sanner, the briefer, and thrown her under the bus, that he, if he'd been in charge, would have immediately either come to her defense or at the very least picked up the phone, called the National Security Advisor and said, if that happens again, I'm out of here. And I'm out of here making all kinds of trouble for you. And B, call in every national security reporter and background brief the hell out of it, supporting your briefer. None of that happened. And I think this may well be a case of she's a covert operative. It's in her DNA. She's spent her whole career trying to be invisible. This doesn't come naturally to her. It came much more naturally to the Leon Panettas of this world, who knew how to deal with Congress and the White House and the public. And she's been disappointing in that respect. And one other quick thing, which is the CIA director also has to be as you well know, Bruce, traditionally, as always, the best ones have been honest brokers who do not put their thumb on the scale of policy or recommending lethal action of one kind or another. You present options. And by all accounts, she was really gung-ho on the lethal targeting of General Soleimani, of the Iranian general. You can argue the merits of that. You can argue that either way, of whether Soleimani should have been taken out. But by all accounts, she was very gung-ho about that, reportedly. And that's really not the role, in my view, of the honest broker of intelligence.
It's troubling. It's troubling because for understandable reasons, the counterterrorism community, which I see is huge, big part, not all, but huge part, has gotten extremely good at what they call decapitation, which is taking out terrorists. And obviously, in some cases, the world applauds them. Leon Panetta's leadership in bringing Osama bin Laden to justice is one of the CIA's highest moments, best performances. But when you start thinking about taking out government officials who undoubtedly are engaged in terrorism, you start to cross another line, because you're then risking state conflict. And I don't think we've seen the end yet of the Omar Soleimani business. It also raises dangerous consequences for our own core operations. One of the things we zealously avoided in the Cold War was situations where we killed Russian intelligence officers, but they killed American officers. And that's not because the Russians were nice guys, because both sides knew that once you started that, you were on a very slippery path. Let me just come back to the point about briefing the public and briefing the president. As we think about the future, it seems to me one of the messages of your epilogue is that the CIA and the intelligence community needs to think about its customers a little bit differently. The traditional obsession of the CIA is the first customer, the president. Getting in there in the morning and briefing him, maybe someday a her, is the overwhelming purpose for the entire institution. The PDB is the most important, and everything else is not B or C, it's R or S in order of priorities. It's also interesting that since different presidents received the PDB in different ways, the mood of the organization is visibly affected. Bill Clinton was not a morning person, to put it mildly. He never got an oral briefing, or rarely got an oral briefing, because he just wasn't up. But he read the book very, very closely and marked it up. But the agency's morale was terrible because they didn't have access to it. W may not have listened to what was in the book, may have ignored the warnings, but he loved having the meetings. And the agency's morale went through the roof. I can only imagine with Trump, he doesn't take oral briefings and doesn't read. Morale's got to be hurt very bad. And in addition, the whole business of extricating the agency, coming out there on his first day on the job and trashing Wall of Heroes and all of that. My point is, as we think about the future, presidents and I think the Congress needs to say to the intelligence community, yes, of course the president is the first customer. The Congress, and through the Congress, the American public needs to be a customer as well. You have an obligation to make your views known to the American public. One simple way to do that would, of course, be to legislate the worldwide threat briefing. Say this is not a discretionary,
not an optional exercise. Yeah.
Right. Make it a legal responsibility, and you could do it on a semi-annual basis. So they appear twice a year. Now, those hearings can be kept classified. But even a classified briefing usually has a public consequence afterwards. And it seems to me that ought to be a change. I were to recommend to Joe Biden one thing to do, I think I would recommend something like that.
I really completely agree with you. And I think that the other thing that, frankly, I think never got enough discussion, and I was talking about it a moment ago, for lack of a better phrase, I don't think anybody is clear about what the rules of engagement are for targeted killings of figures like General Soleimani either. So I wonder if that isn't something that needs to be looked at. But I agree. I mean, those two things, and it may be as simple as making the WWTA a required thing. You may be right.
But while we're talking about taking out terrorists, one of the most revealing parts of the book is insights into the killing of Imad Mughniyeh. Now, in the post 9/11 world,
are we allowed to say his name out loud, Bruce?
I think so. I think it's safe. You know, in a world dominated by Soleimani and Osama bin Laden, many younger Americans never heard of Imad Mughniyeh. But Imad Mughniyeh was probably the worst terrorist of the 1980s, 90s, and God. Responsible for the two attacks on the American embassy in Beirut. He's responsible for the Marine Corps bombing. He's responsible for the abduction of numerous Americans and Brits and others held hostage in Lebanon. The hostage taking spree that is directly linked to the Iran-Contra scandal and to the almost complete discrediting of Ronald Reagan in his second term. You tell us in the book more about how Imad Mughniyeh was taken out than I've ever seen anywhere else. I don't want you to spoil the book, because I certainly want people to buy it. But can you speak a little bit about, first of all, why people wouldn't talk to you about it, and then what you ultimately learned?
Yeah, sure. It's the most incredible untold story I can think of in over the last 50 years, because, as you say, Imad Mughniyeh was in the most wanted terrorist in CIA history. He did he was responsible for all of the things you just talked about. And he was considered the most intelligent, crafty, elusive character they'd ever gone after. He wore disguises. CIA literally had one grainy photograph of him, and that was it. They could never keep up with him or pin him down. Among other things, he was a brilliant operational chief of Hezbollah. He created the so-called shaped charge, which was a super sophisticated IED that would go through the steel of a tank like a knife through butter, and it literally drove the Israelis out of Lebanon. I mean, that weapon alone. So he was this extraordinarily dangerous character, and the CIA and Mossad chased him for decades. I tell the story, which I won't go into detail about, but which has never been told, about the time that the CIA very nearly got him on Bill Clinton's watch and George Tenet's watch as CIA director. They tried to kidnap him in Beirut and take him to a ship offshore and failed. A decade went by before they finally found him again. it became a joint CIA Mossad operation that finally resulted in his death in Damascus in 2008. And it's an unbelievable, hair-raising story, as you know, Bruce, the way they got him. Nobody will talk about Imad Magnia. No one in any position of responsibility at CIA or in the US government or former CIA directors will say anything about him to this day. They won't talk. I believe, the best I can, I asked every CIA director, and they all said, no, we can't address it. Yesterday, I was speaking to the Kennedy School, the intelligence project at the Kennedy School, and I had a bunch of Middle Eastern active intelligence operatives, none of whom would comment either. So it's extraordinary. And I think it's because a deal was struck. And I think that George W. Bush promised the Israelis in 2008 that the US would never acknowledge its role in the mission. And you can read all about it in the book. But the last thing I'll say about it is that I harassed poor John Brennan. And I wouldn't take no for an answer, kept asking him what he could tell me about Imad Magnia. And Brennan finally paused and said, he died quickly. Period. End of subject.
That's very John Brennan. Speaking of which, John is about to publish his own memoirs. Time to come out just after the election. John was not in my CT class when I joined the agency, but 2 classes later. So I've known him from the late 1970s. He has become one of the most vocal directors, particularly since he left. He's all but said that in his judgment, Donald Trump is an agent of Russian intelligence. Whether he's a witting agent or an unwitting agent is the question, but he's an agent of Russian intelligence. I'm very sympathetic to his argument. Certainly Donald Trump's behavior around Russia is extraordinary. There's much more that we someday, I think, will know than we know now. But for a former director to come out with statements like that, very unusual. And George has taken some criticism. John has taken some criticism and heat, including a recent review of his forthcoming memoirs by David Ignatius. For this. It all gets back to the question we've been kind of coming at for the last 45 minutes, which is, what is the director's responsibility vis-a-vis the public, vis-a-vis explaining what's going on? And what's their responsibility after they leave the job to speak out? In those cases where we have directors who've written memoirs like Leon Panetta, they're very revealing. They don't really tell you anything, no real secrets. There's a lot of good atmospherics, but rarely do you get a humdinger, wow, I didn't know that. What's your view on Brennan in particular, his speaking out? On directors in general. Yeah. You've talked to every living director now. So you've heard from the word's mouth how they see their performance.
Let me begin by saying I'm glad you brought up Panetta, because I had a big advantage writing this book over all of the CIA directors and anybody who's ever worked there, which is no review board. Nobody reviewed anything I wrote. And if CIA directors told me more than they probably should have at times, and some of them did. Nobody was in the room to say, excuse me, Mr. Panetta, you really can't say that. So I was really lucky in that respect. And you're right that Panetta doesn't reveal secrets in his memoir, but he sure told me an amazing story about standing in Arlington Cemetery at one point, and he was at the funeral for a young woman who had died in a suicide bombing in Afghanistan. And at that moment, as he was standing at her graveside, he got word from Operations Center that there was an Al-Qaeda terrorist plotting attacks against the US in the crosshairs of a CIA drone at that moment. And he was also told that there were innocent civilians, quote, in the shot, end quote, as he put it. And Panetta told me all about how he called the White House and said, what do you think? And the White House said, this is on you, Leon. And he said, thanks a lot. Fingering his rosary beads and saying his Hail Marys as a devout Catholic, made the decision to green light the lethal drone strike, which did in fact wind up killing some civilians. And we got him, as Leon said to me. He said, but you know what? Ultimately, all you can do is hope that God agrees with you. It's really extraordinary, and I hope if the book does anything, I hope it humanizes the directors in situations like that. To answer your question about Brennan, it's absolutely true that there's a lot among a lot of retired directors and other CIA officials. There's a lot of resentment toward Brennan about how vocal he's been and how quote unquote partisan he's been against Trump. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with it. I was with Bob Gates at his cabin on a lake in Seattle, outside Seattle, when the letter arrived for him to sign protesting the removal of Brennan's security clearance. And Gates told me, I'm gonna sign it, but I sure don't agree with a lot of the stuff that Brennan's saying and doing. So there's people are uncomfortable about Brennan. The irony here is that Brennan, as partisan as he is, by all accounts, when he was CIA director with Obama, he was scrupulously nonpartisan and the honest broker of intelligence. By all accounts, everybody I talked to who'd been in the Situation Room with him said Brennan would come in and just let Obama have it, whatever it was. He wasn't afraid to tell Obama stuff he didn't want to hear. So I would respectfully suggest to a lot of the former CIA directors that while this tradition of being above the fray and nonpartisan as a former director is something that in ordinary circumstances and normal times absolutely is valuable and traditional, that these are exceptional circumstances. We have not had a president before who stood on a stage in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin and basically took his word over our own intelligence community. And I think it should tell people something when not only John Brennan, but General Mike Hayden and James Clapper and a lot of other people have decided that these are times that are not normal with a president who is not normal, and we are compelled to speak up.
I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. These are extraordinary times. Not a normal president. He doesn't abide by the normal responsibilities of the job. And he has a very suspicious relationship with the foreign embassy. I would hope that post-Trump era, we get a thorough investigation carried out into this. Some will say, you know, let it go. This sounds a lot like examining Hillary's emails after 2016. But this isn't a question of being sloppy with your email. This is much more important and critical question. You don't have the.
Yeah, let me just add to that, Bruce, that Bob Woodward reports that Dan Coates, the former Senator Dan Coates, former DNI, became convinced that the Russians had something on Trump. He couldn't think of any other possibility. I found in my reporting of the book, senior CIA officials, former senior CIA officials, one of whom ran Russian operations for years, who said after Helsinki that this one person in particular said, after Helsinki, I could think of no other possibility. No possibility other than Vladimir Putin has something on Donald Trump. And he didn't mean compromat. It could have been a financial relationship, but something.
Well, we're almost out of time. But this also gets us back to the subject that we've gone around and round and round, which is what is a director's responsibility to inform the public when they have information that is significantly damaging. If John Brennan only overlapped with Donald Trump a matter of a few hours, I guess, maybe not even a few hours, but only had access to classified information for the brief period between the election and the inauguration. If he's come to these things, if Dan Coates has come to these things, you've got to wonder, what does Gina Haspel know?
Yeah.
It is, after all, the former Soviet Russian intelligence services have to be in the top 5 targets of the CIA. Try to learn things about, and it's worrisome that we haven't had any peak in that. And I guess that the Republicans have done a pretty good job on the Hill, making it almost impossible for Democrats to ask those kinds of questions. Normal oversight you get from the HIPC and the Senate Select Intelligence Committee has been not working very effectively in the last 4 years. It's tragic.
That's true. And as you well know, back in the 70s, after the so-called family jewels were disclosed, that 693-page compendium of skullduggery and attempted assassination plots and everything else, the whole world of intelligence changed. Congressional oversight began. It changed everything for the better. And after this period of time, when we've been governed, I use that word loosely, by a president whose loyalties are questionable at best, you would think that it would be time for some reform. It would be time for some checks and balances. I mean, it's true that the oversight has been effective, but lately not so much, as you say.
Well, the oversight that came out of the 1970s has not only been good for the country, I would argue it's good for the agency. The agency should be able to say, after any covert operation, no, we told you we were going to do this. We came up here. We said, this is what we're going to do. And none of you said, no, don't do it. Or, 5 out of 7 of you said, do it. That's good in the long run. I think our time has reached its period. I want to remind people again, Spymasters, It's a great book. It's innovative, and it fills a niche that was there, not only in telling the stories of modern directors of Central Intelligence, but really telling the story of what is a director of Central Intelligence? What do they do all day? What are their responsibilities? And how do they interact? That story had never really come out before, and I think it's very, very important that it has. And so I want to thank you, Chris, for being on the show today, and thank our audience for watching.
Bruce, what a pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for all your insights for the book.